This is Recording to the Cloud. Week 9. We're starting a little early this week because of the wonderful things Christian does. No, because our guests are coming early because they teach tonight. We went back and forth as to the time, so I apologize to people who want a later start. I had to find a time in which they could both make it. We have a later start, but then we changed back and forth. Anyhow, I'm going to finish a little talk about Vygotsky and then get into Curt Bonk. Then we're going to take a break and we're going to have our guests. Well, after the guests, I'll be talking about applications of constructivism and all that kind of stuff. So here we go. Let's see if I can share my screen and find my slides and all the important things like that. I was just in these, so I know it's only a heartbeat away. All right, so last week, and I think it might be best if I went back here, I was chatting with you about scaffolded instruction and ZPDs and zones of proximal development, how important it is to nurture, prompt, and rouse minds to life by a more experienced peer or an adult. Unlike Piaget's theory, Vygotsky thinks, the assistant has to come from more capable others in one's environment to push and prod and provoke learning and development to happen. Learning preceding development happens in anticipation of competence. And there are certain through and defined for you last week. I'm not going to do them again because they're in last week's lecture, and you don't want me repeating myself over and over again. But I had some main tenets of Vygotsky or neo-Vygotskyan points of view, in that the focus is on the co-construction of knowledge in and amongst others on a team or as part of a group. And what we're trying to do is to influence cognitive development through the external aids, prompts, assistance in one's culture, in one's environment. The processes of development are culturally specific, not universal, as Piaget would say. They take place in a context of one's learning, and therefore you hear terms mentioned by learning science people called situated cognition, which springs from this methodology, or from this theory, I should say. So instruction precedes development. We don't have to wait for development to occur. That Vygotsky says the great American question, or that Piaget said was the great American question. Whether we could accelerate learning, I think Vygotsky would be in the camp that says you can accelerate, and Piaget would be in the camp that says, no, you shouldn't even bother trying. So learning takes place in a social setting with others. We jointly solve problems, hopefully in authentic situations. But what's part and parcel of both theories or approaches or research that's been done by Piaget and Vygotsky is they think language is critical. But they put a little different emphasis on the inner speech that one might have, the self-talk that one has. Vygotsky says it's critical to self-talk yourself through, and so therefore I'm not going crazy, I'm not insane, because I'm talking to myself all the time. And so does Christian, and so are probably most of you. So similarities between Piaget and Vygotsky is really active constructivistic forms of learning, as part and parcel to what each of them talked about. And that we go through distinct stages along our developmental path. That's also part of each. So they're active, they're stage-like, they focus on learners constructing, doing, actively striving, pushing ahead. They're progressive theories, if you will, of education. They're both interested in the relationship between thought and language. In fact, Vygotsky's got a book called Thought and Language. It's a little dense, I would say, that came out a second time or a third time or a fourth time in 1986, long since he passed away, 50 years or so. But that's a popular book. His other one, Mind and Society, is 1978. That's a little more readable. So therefore, they have a lot of similarities, but also some differences. Whereas Vygotsky put the emphasis on, the teacher in one's environment, helping the child co-construct knowledge and scaffold that process, and the focus on collaboration with more skilled others. Piaget was more focused on interaction with one's peers, and really the focus is on the child, the individual constructing knowledge, not on the team or the social setting or the environment or the community. So Vygotsky's in the cultural context, and he frames up all his terminology within that. And Piaget was really focused on the individual child. And he says that when we talk and we speak aloud, it's just something we should ignore. It's egocentric speech. It's not that important. Whereas for Vygotsky, it was a sign of learning being internalized, that the strategies and ideas and activities were on the path to becoming fossilized or crystallized, I guess, and appropriate for your own needs and uses. Inner speech, again, being important in a Vygotskian or neo-Vygotskian point of view, and it being ignored or seemed to be not that important in a Piagetian point of view. And there are many differences between Piaget and Vygotsky. In fact, I have a little quiz I could bring out next time and walk us through a little quiz between the two and have you guess which one Vygotsky said and which Piaget said and which neither said. Maybe Christian said or I said. So Piaget is more of a developmental approach to understanding individual learners and cognition. And Vygotsky puts more focus on the social side. Some say that Piaget, if he had lived 100 and whatever today would be, 125, 126 years old today, that maybe the last 50 years of his life, he would have spent looking at the social side of learning. There was so much to do looking at the individual child, it sucked up all his time. So for Piaget, it's what's happening inward that helps us work outward. So we have to understand cognitive processes internally before we understand how one acts in amongst other people in one's environment. For Vygotsky, it's the opposite. First, we look at the outward actions and activities, that activity plane I mentioned earlier. We have to look at that social setting, that context, and then we can start looking at what gets appropriated internally for one's intra-psychological processes. So for Vygotsky, it's a two-tiered system. We move intra-psychologically in and amongst other people, or interpersonally, you might say, more towards a intra-psychologically focus, but still, you notice that each one ends up looking at the individual at some point in time. You see, it's just that the Piagetians out there start with the individual, the Vygotskians end with it. And so the social critical theorists out there say that maybe both were wrong, or both didn't have an expansive point of view of the learning environment, because ultimately the neo-Vygotskians even look at the individual problem-solving approaches. So from individual to social for Piaget, from social to individual for Vygotsky, from letting learning follow development, that we have to be at maybe concrete operations or formal operations to be able to make analogies and metaphors and all this. So we have to follow. Learning can't happen until we get to a developmental stage. For Vygotsky, he says, no, we can provoke learning to happen or development to happen by having different learning episodes. So learning precedes development. For him, for Piaget, everything's universal and stage-like, and it's age-dependent somewhat, not fully exactly age, but certain things happen at age 7 and 8 and 10 and 11 and 1 and 2. For Vygotsky, he wasn't that much concerned about the age. He was more concerned about the interactions in one's environment. So interactions for Piaget is intrapersonal. We construct by ourselves, typically, out in the learning world. For Vygotsky, it's interpersonal, as mentioned. Teacher role, for Piaget, it's quite limited. But for Vygotsky, it's significant. Therefore, if you're in teacher training, I would think that you would be more apt to read Vygotsky cover to cover, because it has a lot to say about what you can do to be a successful teacher and to help your students be successful. For Piaget, very classroom discovery oriented. Every kid does their own inquiry-based learning project. For Vygotsky, it's more group and socially interactive setting that we create. And there's Vygotsky's followers. After he died, they all look kind of dead, actually, in that picture. It's not the happiest faces I've ever seen. We move on to Jerome Bruner, who passed away in 2016, a few months short of his 101st birthday. He was born in 1915, October 1915, died in the summer of 2016. I met him once at the AERA conference. Maybe it was in San Francisco in the exhibit hall. He was with Barbara Rogoff, whose book I was using, and so I introduced myself to her, and she introduced me to Jerome Bruner. I should have stayed longer and chatted with him and maybe got his autograph and his picture, but back then, this is like before digital phones, or mobile phones could snap pictures. I don't think I had a mobile phone at the time. It was the 1990s, probably early 1990s. I'm guessing 92, maybe 89, somewhere between there. It was held. 95 was also in San Francisco, so it could have been any one of those. I don't know, but he has a number of books that were used in IST quals in the old day when we had PhD students sit down for quals. They would assign people to read certain writings from Bruner. Bruner is the one who got everyone thinking about open classrooms and everyone taking down walls. If you didn't have walls in your elementary school, that was not what he meant, but that's how teachers read it, or that's how principals read the idea, and therefore they tore down the walls. He also talked about the spiral curriculum. So therefore you have American civilization for 5th grade, for 6th grade, American history for 6th graders, American history for 7th graders, American history for 8th graders, American history for 9th graders. It all spirals and gets more difficult and challenging as they move up and along. So for Bruner, he didn't necessarily, he was like kind of more like Vygotsky than he was like Bruner, but he's kind of a happy medium in between the two. And he gave a speech in 1996 that one of my grad students attended. Her name's Julia Matuga, the former research dean at Bowling Green University in around Toledo, in maybe Bowling Green, Ohio. Julie sat in and listened to his brilliant talk and tape recorded it and then translated it or created a transcript of it for my class. So we got to enjoy Bruner's celebration of the 100-year anniversary of Piaget's life and 100-year anniversary of Vygotsky's life. And the basic premise of the talk was, at the time, was that if only Piaget had existed, it would dramatically change psychology. If only Vygotsky had existed, it would dramatically change psychology. The fact that both individuals existed and they're both born the same year is kind of an irony in psychology. So the assumptions from a Bruner standpoint is we don't need to consider age dependencies, and it's in developmental sequences, not invariant, not universal, but the focus for Bruner is cognitive development. Like Piaget, like Vygotsky, they end up coming back to the individual cognitive development, what happens in one's brain. Even though Vygotsky cares about the social interaction, even though Piaget believes in construction out there, discovery and coding, for instance, programming, having kids program or have their Lego logo blocks and create Lego robotics. It's ultimately what happens in the head that they. But for Vygotsky, the thinking, the brain extends beyond the skin to our one's social networks, of course. Cognitive growth involves interaction between basic human capacities and culturally invented technologies like Vine and Line and LinkedIn and Facebook and WeChat and Kakao Talk and all these other technologies that we might use, whether it's Jamboard or Padlet or something else, that amplify or have the capability to augment our learning and amplify us, our thinking in some ways, to create notes, to create timelines, and to create concept maps and other kinds of things, so that we can offload some of the cognitive resources to those technological tools. But we still need the internal wetware as well as the software. The aim of education from a Brunerian point of view is to create people who know how to learn, empowered, autonomous, self-directed human beings. That's the goal. And our goal as instructors or instructional designers to make sure that the learner is ready and able to perform a task or to engage in a particular situation. So it's readiness through the set of experiences, activities, tasks, and contexts that we provide for those learners. Instruction should be structured so that it can be easily grasped. So we bring it down to the lowest level to make it authentic and genuine for that learner. And Bruner would believe that almost all learning could be simplified so much that any learner could understand some aspect of it if we dumb it down to, she maybe wouldn't say dumb it down, but you know what I mean. Instruction should be designed to facilitate extrapolation or filling in the gaps, going beyond the information given. So instruction should facilitate or help nurture new thought to life. There's no universal sequence. There's no optimal pattern or path that one engages with. We are all co-determined by our prior histories, our prior knowledge, our familiarity, our successes and failures along the way, as well as the stages of development that we are in at the present time. All these things matter. The nature of the learning materials themselves, how complex that they are, how interactive that they are, and other assorted learning differences. He has an example. I won't read this whole quote about understanding prime numbers. I'll let you, the notes are posted. He mainly has 3 stages that he talks about how, but we don't necessarily have to go through all 3 stages as we move up to formal operations. We can start with symbolic stage, but in early childhood, we have an active where knowledge is stored in the form of motor responses. It's very limited in nature, to learning through the iconic stage where knowledge is stored with images, visuals of some sort, and then we get into concepts, conceptual understanding and symbolic understanding, and words and definitions with symbolic reasoning. Students have a predisposition towards learning according to Bruner. We all want to learn, we all strive, we all have goals, we all are curious in some way, shape, or form. The most effective sequence is to present materials what he was concerned about. How do we create curriculum in schools? I guess, if you will, of all these people, he really had a lot to say up to schools, to school systems, about how they might design instruction, and a lot to say to instructional designers. There are ways in which a body of knowledge can be structured so they can be grasped by 5-year-olds or 10-year-olds or 15-year-olds, and it might depend upon their stage of development. And there might be certain rewards that are placed in one's environment, or prompts or hints or cues. So any subject, so he likes to use the word honest. Any subject can be taught effectively at some intellectually honest form to any child. If you bring it to talk about McDonald's Happy Meals to a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, they might understand some analogy that you're trying to make, but you have to provide instruction from within that standpoint. So subject matter has to be ready for the learner for their stage of development that they're at. Instructional challenge is to provide problems that fit the child's thinking and their level, as well as foster them or nudge them to engage in more powerful aspects of thinking, to push in their ZPD, to nudge them forward beyond where they're at. That's the challenge of all instructors, but not to push too far beyond what they're capable of so that they would give up. And so when you see a dissertation defense, you'll see some instructors pushing really hard and almost to the point where the whole audience is crying, but yet they realize that the ZPD of the candidate, the doctoral candidate, that person can handle it. So the wise, the savvy mentors and committee members of a doctoral dissertation take Bruner to heart, in effect. Educators should keep in mind that members of different cultures exhibit different kinds of reasoning, and therefore is no universals. He's like Vygotsky, as I mentioned. So there are different modes of representation, and active, iconic, and symbolic. They imply a sequence that we go through, but that sequence isn't always the case when we move into adulthood, that we can, as I said, get into symbolic reasoning and reflection and metacognition early on. We don't need to do hands-on discovery-based forms of learning or some kind of visualization and so forth, but that we spiral the curriculum so that we start with those inactive hands-on tasks and discovery forms of learning or inquiry forms of learning early on. It's not to say that discovery and inquiry aren't important later on. It's just that we don't need to necessarily rely upon them later in one's late childhood and early adulthood. Discovery is not just an instructional technique, it's an important learning outcome in itself. So these are some implications of Bruner. I'm at the end there. I will stop that. We've only got you and I here so far. Christian, you have a comment before I shut this down and we go to break time?
I'm a big fan of Vygotsky.
You want a Vygotsky pin and Vygotsky shirt. Okay, I
I
understand.
do.
Okay. All I have is these
But
IST pins,
yeah, it's missing the Vygotsky.
Yeah. It's
Go
the
Lev.
big B and big P. Which
Yeah.
do early in ed psych, I think maybe the 1980s, late 80s, I taught undergrad ed psych. I would say Piaget was probably more prominent in undergraduate educational psychology books than Vygotsky. And they had a whole chapter devoted. And as I may have said previously, the moral majority was tried to, make an impact in terms of with school curriculum. And so because Vygotsky being a Marxist, they wanted all Vygotsky eliminated from undergraduate textbooks. Some people, not across the board. Some people did. You'd read about from time to time. Vygotsky, Piaget was not controversial politically. Educationally, maybe somewhat controversial. Every theorist is. You could criticize every theory from the standpoint of trying to create generic models to represent human learning, to try and create universals. There are always exceptions to the rules, and all the experiments that Vygotsky or Piaget based his findings on, and studying his own kids, the scientific studies that he engaged in, a lot of that relied on math, and so if you take some of those same things and use it in a different context other than math and science, kids might do quite well, and it's also dependent upon what they were taught in math and in other areas. I will end there. I want to thank people for coming to part 1 of 3 parts tonight for week 9 in R511, spring of 1999, no, of 2023. And I'm going to push this off to the cloud, stop the recording, and it is going to the cloud. We'll take a little break and we'll come back with our guests for tonight, Jason and Rick West, Jason McDonald and Rick West. I hope you can join us.